Global debt has crossed $300 trillion, 4 times the size of the entire global economy. It should have collapsed by now, but it hasn't, and it won't. This is forgotten economy, where debt, empires, and hidden financial systems intersect. The 2008 crisis should have destroyed the banking system. The Eurozone crisis should have shattered the euro. Japan's debt exceeds 250% of GDP and has for decades. Every signal pointed to collapse. None of it happened. Why? We've explored how debt circulates, how inflation erodes value, how money is created from nothing. What we haven't answered is why none of this ever causes a clean collapse. Because the system isn't designed to collapse. It's designed to bend. Debt is older than currency itself. The first written records we have, clay tablets from Mesopotamia, carved thousands of years before Christ, weren't poetry or philosophy. They were ledgers, records of obligation. Who owed grain? Who owed livestock? Who held the debt? In these early societies, debt wasn't just economic, it was sacred. Priests and kings enforced obligations. But they also understood something modern systems pretend to forget. Debt cannot grow indefinitely without destroying the structure that holds it. That's why ancient rulers declared jubilees, moments when all debts were erased. Not out of mercy, out of necessity. Because they recognized that when too many people owe too much for too long, the social order collapses from within. The system required a reset button. That was the design. By the Renaissance, debt had evolved. Banking families like the Medici turned debt into an instrument of geopolitics. Kings borrowed to wage wars. Popes borrowed to build cathedrals. Credit replaced grain as the currency of power. But the risks remained. Spain, flooded with silver from the New World, declared bankruptcy 4 times in the 16th century. Not because it lacked wealth, because it borrowed beyond what wealth could sustain. That's the first pattern. Even empires with gold can drown in debt when ambition exceeds capacity. Debt was no longer personal. It shaped wars. It toppled dynasties. It redrew borders. The modern debt explosion begins in the 20th century. After World War I, nations carried obligations so massive that repayment seemed impossible. Germany, burdened with reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, faced debts so crushing that economists warned they would destabilize the country. They were right. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s, Germans carrying wheelbarrows of worthless paper currency to buy bread, was a direct result of debt obligations that could not be met in real terms. That collapse shaped the political conditions that led to the Second World War. Debt wasn't just an accounting issue, it was the accelerant of chaos. Then came 1944, Bretton Woods. The financial architecture of the modern world was built in a single conference. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold at the end of the war. It set the rules. The dollar became the anchor, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency pegged itself to the dollar. The intent was stability. The result was dependence. Every government bond, every economic calculation now rested on the assumption that the United States would maintain discipline. It worked for a while. But the temptation to spend beyond your means doesn't disappear just because you write it into a treaty. By the 1960s, the costs of the Vietnam War and domestic programs had mounted. The United States printed more dollars than it had gold to back them. Foreign governments noticed. They began demanding gold in exchange for paper. In 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar's link to gold was severed. Debt was now untethered. That moment was the quiet revolution. It transformed debt from something finite into something infinite. With gold removed, governments discovered they could borrow and print at will, limited only by confidence. Central banks learned to manipulate interest rates to manage economies. When growth slowed, lower rates encouraged borrowing. When crisis hit, more debt was created to patch the wound. Each intervention required more leverage than the last. The 1980s saw public debt expand under leaders like Reagan and Thatcher, justified as necessary for defense or reform. Developing nations borrowed heavily from Western banks, triggering the Latin American debt crisis when repayment became impossible. The pattern was set. Use debt to chase growth, then collapse when the cycle turns. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't just about housing. It was about debt layered upon debt, a structure of leverage so complex that when one corner crumbled, the entire system shook. Mortgages were packaged into securities, sold to investors, insured with derivatives, amplified by leverage ratios of 30-1. The collapse wiped out banks, destroyed pensions, forced governments to intervene with trillions in bailouts. Here was the deeper design revealed. Those who borrowed recklessly were rescued. Ordinary people were left with foreclosures, unemployment, austerity. Debt was shown to be not a neutral tool, but a system built to protect the powerful. Since then, the numbers have moved from alarming to incomprehensible. Global debt has tripled in 2 decades, surpassing $300 trillion by 2023. That's nearly 4 times global GDP. Governments, corporations, households, all have added to the pile. Japan's public debt exceeds 200% of GDP. The United States adds trillions annually with minimal debate. Emerging economies borrow in foreign currencies, exposing themselves to sudden collapse when rates shift. The entire system has become a balancing act, where stability depends on the belief that debt can expand forever without breaking. But debt always breaks. It distorts incentives. It creates bubbles. It shifts wealth from those who produce to those who lend. And most critically, it binds future generations to obligations they never agreed to. Every dollar borrowed today is a claim on tomorrow's labor. When the numbers grow large enough, repayment becomes structurally impossible. That's why history is filled with defaults, restructurings, inflations, and resets. Debt always resolves one of 3 ways. You repay it honestly, you inflate it away, or you default. But here's what's different now. Here's what history tells us about why modern debt doesn't collapse the way it used to. The assumption is that when debt grows beyond reason, the system collapses. But history shows something different. It bends, it adjusts, it transforms, but it rarely breaks cleanly. When debt becomes unsustainable, there are only a few mechanisms the system can use. None of them are collapse. All of them are absorption. The first is inflation. We've covered how this mechanism works, the erosion of purchasing power that makes debt lighter in real terms. But what matters here isn't the mechanism. It's that inflation allows adjustment without default. The second is restructuring, forcing creditors to accept reduced payments. Argentina did this repeatedly. Russia did it in 1998. Each triggered temporary chaos. But notice what happened afterward. The countries returned to borrowing within years. The system absorbed them back in. The third is outright default, refusing to pay. History is filled with sovereign defaults. Each triggered crisis. But none ended the global debt system. These aren't collapse. They're adjustment mechanisms that preserve the structure. So why doesn't the system collapse even when it should? Because collapse requires simultaneous failure across all participants. And the system is designed with circuit breakers. Central banks can create liquidity instantly. Governments can shift obligations forward in time. Creditors can be negotiated with, coerced, or simply paid with newly created money. The global financial architecture has built-in pressure release valves that activate long before total breakdown. That's not a defense of the system, it's an observation of how it functions. The 2008 crisis should have collapsed the banking system. It didn't. Central banks intervened with trillions in liquidity. The debt wasn't eliminated, it was transferred from private banks to public balance sheets. The structure bent, but it held. The Eurozone debt crisis should have shattered the currency union. It didn't. Bailouts, restructurings, and central bank backstops kept it intact. Countries suffered, but the system absorbed the shock. Japan has carried debt exceeding 200% of GDP for decades. Economists predicted crisis repeatedly. It hasn't come. The Bank of Japan owns nearly half of government bonds. Interest rates remain near zero. The obligation exists on paper, but the mechanism for managing it has adapted. This is the pattern. Debt doesn't trigger collapse. It triggers management. But there's a cost to this perpetual adjustment. The cost is distributed silently. Inflation erodes savings. Restructuring wipes out bondholders. Bailouts transfer risk from the reckless to the public. Growth slows under the weight of servicing obligations. Wealth concentrates among those who understand the mechanisms and can position themselves accordingly. The system doesn't collapse, but it extracts payment in other forms. Your purchasing power declines gradually. Your wages stagnate while asset prices inflate. The returns on your savings disappear while those with access to leverage multiply their wealth. Political trust erodes as publics realize the adjustments always favor creditors over citizens. This is how the debt system survives, not by solving the problem, but by diffusing the consequences across time and populations in ways that prevent organized resistance. The consequences are everywhere, but most people don't see them because debt has become invisible. When your government runs a deficit, it doesn't ask for cash. It issues bonds, sells them to banks or foreign investors, and quietly builds obligations in your name. When you use a credit card, you're not paying, you're borrowing. When corporations announce record profits, those gains are often amplified by borrowed money used to buy back stock. The system runs on leverage. But leverage works like gravity, weightless on the way up, crushing on the way down. The financial system today floats on promises that may not hold. Take the United States. Its national debt passed $34 trillion in 2024. That number is so abstract it loses meaning, but translate it into reality. Every taxpayer carries hundreds of thousands in future obligations. Interest payments alone now rival defense spending. The world's largest economy is borrowing money just to pay interest on money it already borrowed. This isn't unique. Across Europe, debt-to-GDP ratios remain above 100% in Italy, Greece, and others. In China, the explosion has been hidden in local governments and state enterprises, creating shadow liabilities that may far exceed official figures. Everywhere, debt has metastasized. The trap is psychological as much as financial. Politicians prefer debt because it delays consequences. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting spending angers more. Borrowing seems painless. Future generations will handle it. The illusion holds until it doesn't. When interest rates rise, the burden becomes visible. That's exactly what happened in 2022 when central banks raised rates to combat inflation. Suddenly, the cost of servicing debt surged. Governments faced tighter budgets. Households faced higher payments. Corporations saw refinancing costs explode. Debt is like a sleeping mechanism, harmless while dormant, catastrophic when activated. And yet, even as risks compound, debt continues to be sold as prosperity. Students are told to borrow tens of thousands for degrees that may not pay off. Families are told to stretch for homes they can barely afford because prices always rise. Nations are told deficits don't matter because central banks can print endlessly. This is the core illusion of modern finance, that debt is free, infinite, and safe. History says otherwise. So why does this matter? Because understanding the system means recognizing that waiting for collapse is the wrong framework. The system won't collapse. It will continue to adjust, absorb, and transfer costs, unless enough people understand the mechanics well enough to demand different rules. Debt isn't just economics, it's about power. Who lends determines who owes. Who owns the bonds determines who gets paid when restructuring happens. Who controls central banks determines whose obligations get inflated away and whose wealth gets preserved. The financial architecture is designed so that when debt becomes unmanageable, adjustment protects the structure, not the people within it. Banks get liquidity. Corporations get bailouts. Governments get extensions. Ordinary people get inflation, austerity, and stagnant wages. That's not a conspiracy. It's a design that has been refined over centuries to preserve the system above all else. So what does this mean for you? First, abandon the assumption that the system will collapse and reset cleanly. It won't. It will continue to bend, absorb, and transfer costs in ways that are difficult to trace but easy to feel. Second, recognize that the adjustments are already happening. Inflation is already eroding value. Interest rate manipulation is already distorting markets. Debt expansion is already binding future generations to obligations they haven't agreed to. Third, position yourself accordingly. That doesn't mean panic. It means building wealth that isn't entirely dependent on currency stability. Assets that hold value when purchasing power declines. Knowledge that lets you see adjustments before they're announced. Perspective that prevents you from accepting the system's framing as inevitable. Because the system will continue, but the terms are not fixed. The more people who understand the mechanics, the harder it becomes to extract costs invisibly. This is the lesson of history. Debt doesn't collapse systems, it reshapes them. The question isn't whether the system survives, it's who pays for its survival. Global debt isn't a countdown, it's a mechanism. One that has already proven it can bend further than anyone thought possible. The only question is, how much more bending happens before the terms change? If this shifted how you see the system, subscribe. The adjustments are already in motion.